This is the story of Lila Bennett, a young woman who could see what others couldn't, feel what others had forgotten, and transform spaces with nothing more than an open heart and the courage to speak her truth. But it was a gray December morning in downtown Chicago when Lila Bennett made the mistake that would transform her life. She stepped off the elevator on the 29th floor of the Sinclair Architecture Building, her hands trembling slightly as she balanced the brown paper bag containing someone's lunch order. But this wasn't just any lunch order. Inside that simple brown bag was a preserved egg that would unlock a conversation about the difference between building structures and creating homes. The 29th floor was nothing like the bustling restaurant floors Lila usually visited. Here, everything was steel and glass and expensive silence. The kind of silence that whispered about million-dollar contracts and decisions that shaped city skylines. The kind of silence that made girls like Lila feel invisible. But here's what no one knew about Lila Bennett. Not her customers, not the busy professionals who barely glanced at her as she delivered their meals, not even her own family. Behind her quiet green eyes and carefully invisible presence lived something extraordinary. She could feel spaces the way musicians feel melodies, the way poets feel rhythm, the way healers feel pain that needs tending. As she stood in that pristine hallway, holding a lunch that wasn't meant for this floor, Lila had no idea she was about to walk in the office of Graham Sinclair, a man who had designed buildings worth hundreds of millions of dollars, but had somehow lost the ability to create spaces where hearts could heal. She had no idea that her simple observation about a preserved egg would crack open years of emotional walls built by professional success and personal loss. This morning, as she hesitated outside the corner office, choosing between admitting her mistake and pushing forward into unknown territory, Lila Bennett was about to discover that sometimes the most profound transformations begin with the smallest acts of courage. Sometimes a wrong turn leads to exactly where you need to be. And sometimes the people who seem invisible to the world are the very ones carrying the light others desperately need to see. What happens next will challenge everything you think you know about credentials versus character, about who gets to have good ideas, and about the healing power of authentic human connection in our disconnected world. So settle in, because this journey is about to begin, and I promise you, it's unlike anything you've heard before. Lila's day had started at 5:30 a.m. in the small apartment she shared with her grandmother above Bennett's family kitchen. The restaurant had been struggling since her father's medical bills forced them to let go of most of their staff. Now it was just Lila, her grandmother Rosa, and the weight of keeping a family legacy alive. As she prepared the delivery orders that morning, Lila's hands moved with practiced efficiency, but her mind wandered to the sketch pad hidden under her bed. Once upon a time, she had been a design student at the Art Institute of Chicago. She had dreamed of creating spaces that made people feel safe, inspired, hopeful. But dreams, she had learned, were luxuries her family couldn't afford. "You have good eyes, Mija," her grandmother had told her years ago, watching Lila rearrange the restaurant's cramped seating area to somehow make it feel twice as spacious. "You see with your heart, not just your head." Lila had dismissed it then as grandmother's kind exaggeration. But Rosa Bennett had survived the Depression, raised 6 children, and built a restaurant from nothing. She didn't waste words. Meanwhile, 30 floors above the Chicago streets, Graham Sinclair stood in his corner office, staring at architectural plans that should have excited him but felt as cold as the November morning outside. At 38, he was already one of the most successful architects in Midwest. Sinclair Architecture had designed shopping centers, office complexes, and residential developments across 3 states. But success, Graham had discovered, could be its own kind of prison. The man who once stayed up until dawn sketching buildings that would inspire and nurture human connection now approved designs that prioritized efficiency over emotion, profit margins over people's hearts. His office reflected this transformation. Sparse, modern, everything in its place, nothing that might distract from the business of business. His assistant, Harper Klein, knocked and entered without waiting for permission. At 36, Harper had clawed her way up from a childhood in public housing to her current position as the gatekeeper to one of Chicago's most influential architects. She trusted systems, credentials, and hierarchies because they had saved her when nothing else would. "The Patterson Project meeting is in an hour," Harper announced, setting a stack of contracts on Graham's glass desk. "I've reviewed the interior design proposals. The Hamilton Group has the strongest portfolio, obviously." Graham nodded absently, his eyes still on the plans before him. Once, he would have cared about which colors would make families feel welcome in their new homes. Now he cared about which firm could deliver on time and under budget. In the lobby of the Sinclair building, 65-year-old Ronald Hayes adjusted his security guard uniform and watched the morning rush of young professionals hurrying to elevators. Most people saw him as part of the furniture now, the elderly black man who checked IDs and offered directions to lost visitors. But Ronald Hayes had designed this very building 25 years ago, back when he was Ronald Hayes, AIA senior partner at Hayes & Associates. Before ageism disguised as company restructuring forced him into early retirement. Before his pension disappeared in the 2008 market crash. Before pride became a luxury he couldn't afford. He had taken his job because he needed the health insurance, but he stayed because he still loved watching buildings live and breathe with human energy. From his post in the lobby, he could see which spaces worked and which didn't, which designs nurtured the people inside them, and which felt like beautiful prisons. Ronald had been watching Graham Sinclair for 3 years now, seeing in the younger man's increasingly hollow eyes a reflection of his own lost passion. Sometimes the most important interventions come from the most unexpected sources. None of them knew it yet, but their lives were about to intersect in a way that would remind them all of something our modern world desperately needs to remember. That authentic human connection can heal wounds we didn't even know we carried, and that sometimes the most profound wisdom comes from the most unlikely teachers. The elevator dinged softly as Lila stepped onto the 29th floor, consulting the delivery receipt that clearly read floor 19. But the numbers on the wall said 29, and Lila's natural tendency to avoid confrontation made her hesitate to get back on the elevator and admit her mistake. The hallway stretched before her like something from a design magazine. All clean lines and muted colors, beautiful but somehow cold. Lila found herself studying the space, noting how the lack of warm tones made everything feel distant, clinical. The walls seemed to whisper, "Stay professional, stay separate, stay safe." Following the office numbers, she found herself standing before a door marked Graham Sinclair, Chief Executive Officer. Through the glass wall, she could see a man in his late 30s, tall and lean, with dark hair and the kind of focused concentration that suggested he saw the world in blueprints and bottom lines. Lila knocked softly. "Come in," came the voice, distracted. She entered to find Graham Sinclair studying what appeared to be floor plans for a residential development. The office was as precisely arranged as everything else on this floor. Modern furniture, awards on shelves, not a single personal photograph or splash of unexpected color. "I think there's been a mistake," Lila began quietly, holding up the paper bag. This lunch order was supposed to go to the 19th floor, but Graham looked up, and for just a moment their eyes met. Lila felt something shift in the air between them, though she couldn't name what it was. "What's in the bag?" Graham asked, setting down his pen. Something about this slight young woman, with the careful way she held herself, made him curious rather than irritated at the interruption. It's the Tuesday special from Bennett's Kitchen. Herb-crusted salmon with rice and vegetables," Lila replied, then added with the faintest smile, "My grandmother put a preserved egg in the center because she says it makes everything taste like home." Graham stared at her. "She put an egg in the center because it makes things taste like home." Lila felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I know it sounds silly. It's just, this room feels like it needs something warm in the middle. Something golden. Like that egg." She gestured vaguely toward the space around Graham's desk. "All this gray and white is beautiful, but it's kind of lonely." The words hung in the air between them. Graham had heard thousands of people describe his work over the years. Efficient, impressive, cutting-edge, profitable. No one had ever called any space he designed lonely. No one had ever suggested it needed warmth. "You can see that?" he asked slowly. "Just by walking in here?" Lila nodded, then immediately looked embarrassed. "Sorry, I used to study design before. Anyway, I should let you get back to work." But as she turned to leave, Graham found himself saying, "Wait. You study design?" Graham asked, genuinely curious now. Lila turned back, clutching the paper bag. "For 2 years at the Art Institute. Interior design. But I had to—" She trailed off, then shrugged. "Family business needed me more." Graham looked at her more carefully. Beneath the shy exterior and the simple uniform, he could see something that reminded him of himself at her age. That quality of seeing beyond surfaces, of understanding that spaces were about more than function. "What would you do differently?" he asked, gesturing to his office. "If you were designing this space?" Lila's eyes widened. "Oh, I couldn't. I mean, you're a real architect. You're someone who notices that gray and white can feel lonely," Graham said. "That's not just anything." For a moment, Lila forgot to be shy. Her eyes moved around the office with the focused attention of someone reading a complex text. She walked slowly toward the windows, her fingers trailing along the edge of his desk, and Graham found himself watching her with the same intensity he once brought to studying masterpiece paintings. "The light is beautiful coming through those windows," she began, her voice growing stronger, "but nothing in here reflects it back. It all gets absorbed by the gray. And the furniture." She paused, biting her lip. "Go on," Graham encouraged, realizing he was holding his breath. "Everything is positioned to be impressive, but nothing is positioned for actual conversation. Like if someone came in here upset or excited or just wanted to share something important, where would they sit to feel heard?" Lila turned to face him, and for the first time since entering his office, she looked directly into his eyes. "Your desk is like a fortress wall. Beautiful, but it keeps people at a distance." Graham looked around his office as if seeing it for the first time. Every piece of furniture was indeed positioned for maximum visual impact and professional efficiency. But when had he last had a real conversation here? When had anyone sat across from his desk and shared something that mattered? When had he himself felt truly comfortable in this space he spent most of his waking hours? "What would you change?" he asked quietly. Lila moved toward the seating area near his windows. "This couch is gorgeous, but it faces out toward the view instead of creating a space where two people could really talk. And there's no table between the chairs, nowhere to set a cup of coffee or share something meaningful. It's like," she searched for the words, "it's like the space is designed for admiring rather than connecting." She gestured toward a corner that held nothing but an expensive sculpture. What if that corner had a small round table with 2 comfortable chairs? Not for meetings, just for conversations. Somewhere a person could sit and feel like you were really listening, not just conducting business. Graham found himself walking to the corner she indicated, imagining the scene she described. When was the last time he had really listened to someone? When was the last time someone had felt safe enough to share their real thoughts with him? "The egg in the center," Lila continued quietly, returning to the lunch bag on his desk. "It's not just about taste. It's about creating a focal point that draws people together instead of holding them apart. My grandmother always says that every space needs a heart, something that reminds everyone why they're there together." "And what would be the heart of this office?" Graham asked. Lila was quiet for a moment, studying his face with those perceptive green eyes. "I think it would be whatever reminds you why you became an architect in the first place. What made you want to design buildings? What did you dream of creating?" The question hit Graham like a physical blow. When was the last time anyone had asked him about his dreams rather than his profit margins? When was the last time he had even remembered that architecture had once been about creating beauty, not just efficiency? In the silence that followed, Graham felt something he hadn't experienced in years. The electric moment when someone shows you a truth you didn't know you were missing. But more than that, he felt seen in a way that terrified and thrilled him. This young woman who delivered lunches for a living had looked past his expensive suit and impressive title and somehow glimpsed the artist he had buried beneath years of professional success. I have a project, Graham said suddenly. A residential development. 75 units of affordable housing. The developer wants something that will photograph well for marketing, but I keep thinking. He pulled out the plans he'd been studying when Lila arrived. These families are going to live here. Kids are going to grow up in these spaces. But everything I'm designing feels like those gray walls, technically perfect and emotionally empty. Lila set the lunch bag on his desk and moved closer to look at the blueprints. Graham watched her face as she studied the layouts, seeing her eyes trace the flow from room to room. "May I?" she asked, gesturing toward the plans. Graham nodded, and Lila placed her finger on the central living area of one unit. Right now, the kitchen faces the wall. But if you turn it just slightly toward the main room, then whoever is cooking can see the kids playing or help with homework. The kitchen becomes the heart instead of just a place to make food. She moved her finger to another area. And these bedrooms are all the same size, which is efficient. But what if the smaller ones had built-in storage that also created cozy reading nooks? Kids love small spaces where they can feel safe and dream. Graham found himself leaning closer, caught up in her way of seeing. What about lighting? Natural light in the morning where people eat breakfast, but softer light in the evening areas where families relax together. And colors. Lila's voice grew more confident. Not just white and beige. What if each floor had a subtle color theme? Like the second floor could have hints of sage green, calming but alive. The third floor could have touches of warm terracotta. The developer will say color costs extra, Graham said automatically. Paint costs almost nothing, Lila replied. It's the choices that cost extra. Choosing to see families instead of just square footage. Graham stared at the plans, then at this young woman who carried lunch for a living but saw homes where he had been seeing units. Where did you learn to think like this? Lila smiled sadly. My grandmother. She always said that spaces are like people. They need to feel loved to be their best selves. Graham set down the blueprints and really looked at Lila for the first time. Why did you really leave design school? The question was gentle, but Lila felt tears prick her eyes. My dad had a stroke 2 years ago. The medical bills, the restaurant struggling. I was working 3 jobs just to help keep our family afloat. College felt like a luxury we couldn't afford. And now I deliver lunches and try not to think about what I used to dream about creating. She wiped her eyes quickly. Sorry, you don't need to hear this. But Graham realized he did need to hear it. When had he last talked to someone whose dreams had been interrupted by life's harsh realities? When had he last remembered that design was supposed to serve people who were struggling, not just people who could afford luxury? I used to paint, he said quietly. Lila looked up, surprised by the admission. Landscapes, mostly. I wanted to capture how different places made people feel. My father called it impractical. Said if I was going to work with buildings, I should focus on what paid well. Graham's voice carried years of buried regret. I haven't picked up a paintbrush in 15 years. Do you miss it? Lila asked. Graham was quiet for a long moment. I used to think I didn't. But talking to you about that residential project, it's the first time in years I've thought about what those spaces might feel like to the people living in them. They stood together in the gray office. 2 people who had learned to set aside their hearts for the sake of survival, recognizing something familiar in each other. The moment was interrupted by a sharp knock on the door. Harper Klein entered without waiting for permission, her eyes immediately noting the delivery girl standing close to Graham's desk with blueprints spread between them. Graham, the Patterson meeting starts in 15 minutes, Harper said crisply. And I believe this young lady has deliveries to make. Lila immediately stepped back, remembering her place. Of course. I'm sorry for taking up your time, Mr. Sinclair. But Graham found himself reluctant to let her go. Actually, Harper, I'd like you to meet Lila Bennett. She's been giving me some interesting insights about the Riverside Heights project. Harper's professional smile tightened almost imperceptibly. Insights about creating emotional connection in affordable housing design, Graham continued. Lila has a background in interior design. How wonderful, Harper said, her tone perfectly polite and perfectly cold. And where did you complete your degree, Lila? Lila's face flushed. I didn't finish. I only completed 2 years. I see. Harper's pause was surgical in its precision. Well, I'm sure your perspective is refreshing. But the Patterson Group is expecting professional recommendations from accredited designers. We can't risk our reputation on unqualified opinions, no matter how well-intentioned. Harper turned to Graham, her voice taking on the protective edge she used when she felt her position threatened. Graham, you know I have your best interests at heart. The Sinclair name has been built on excellence and professionalism. We've worked too hard to establish credibility in this industry to risk it on. She gestured vaguely toward Lila, amateur enthusiasm. The words hit Lila like physical blows. Amateur, unqualified, risk. Every fear she had carried about not belonging in professional spaces crystallized in Harper's perfectly articulated dismissal. Harper, Graham said, his voice carrying a warning note that surprised both women. But Harper pressed on, believing she was protecting both their careers. I'm sure Miss Bennett is very intuitive, but intuition doesn't replace education, experience, or professional standards. Our clients expect expertise, not well-meaning guesswork from someone who delivers sandwiches for a living. Graham felt something twist in his chest as he watched Lila's shoulders curve inward, watched her remember that she was just a delivery girl who had wandered into a world where credentials mattered more than insight. He saw her carefully constructed confidence crumble under Harper's professional assault, watched her retreat into the invisibility that had been her protection for years. Of course, Lila said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. I should go. I have other deliveries. As she gathered her things, Graham wanted to say something to assert that vision mattered more than degrees, that heart mattered more than credentials. But Harper was right about one thing. He had a business to run, a reputation to maintain. The weight of professional expectations pressed down on him like the gray walls of his office. Thank you for the lunch, he said finally, inadequately. Lila nodded and left, and Graham watched through his glass wall as she walked back toward the elevators, once again invisible to everyone she passed. The preserved egg sat forgotten on his desk, its golden center now seeming to mock the coldness that had returned to fill the space. Harper began organizing papers for the meeting. I've scheduled presentations from 3 firms for the Riverside Heights interiors. All have extensive portfolios and proper certifications. Graham picked up the forgotten lunch bag and found himself staring at the preserved egg in the center of the rice, golden and somehow hopeful despite everything. For reasons he couldn't explain, it made him think of his abandoned paintbrushes and dreams deferred for so long they felt like someone else's memories. Outside his window, Chicago stretched endlessly gray under November clouds, and Graham wondered when exactly his world had become as cold as his office walls. 3 days passed before Graham saw Lila again. During those 3 days, he found himself distracted during meetings, sketching modifications to the Riverside Heights plans that incorporated her suggestions. When Harper questioned his sudden interest in emotional design concepts, he couldn't explain the pull he felt toward creating spaces that would nurture rather than merely house. The professional presentations for the interior design had been flawless and utterly forgettable. 3 firms with impeccable credentials had shown him color schemes and furniture layouts that photographed beautifully and felt completely soulless. Each presentation had left him thinking about Lila's observation that his office was positioned for maximum visual impact, but not for actual human connection. On Friday afternoon, Graham made a decision that surprised even himself. He took the elevator down to the lobby, where Ronald Hayes was finishing his shift. Ronald, Graham said, approaching the security desk. You've worked in this building for 3 years. Do you know anything about Bennett's Kitchen? Ronald looked up from his logbook, his weathered face showing mild surprise. Sure do, Mr. Sinclair. Family place, been around for decades. Good people. Rosa Bennett makes the best Korean-style eggs in the city. He paused. You thinking of ordering lunch? Actually, I was thinking of visiting. Graham hesitated, then asked, Do you know Lila, the young woman who delivers their orders? Ronald's expression softened. Sweet girl. Works harder than anyone should have to. Try to keep her family's place afloat. He studied Graham's face. Particular reason you're asking? Graham found himself telling Ronald about the conversation in his office, about Lila's insights into the residential project, about the way she had seen emotional needs in spaces where he had only seen square footage. Sounds like she sees what you used to see, Ronald said quietly. What do you mean? Ronald smiled. I helped design this building 25 years ago, back when I was still practicing. I remember the original plans you submitted for the lobby renovation 2 years ago, full of natural light and comfortable seating areas, places where people could actually gather and connect. He gestured toward the current sterile lobby. That's not what got built. Graham stared at the older man. You're an architect, was Ronald corrected. Then I got too old to be profitable, and firms started choosing flashy young talent over experience. Now I watch buildings instead of designing them. There was no bitterness in his voice, only a matter-of-fact sadness that hit Graham unexpectedly hard. Why didn't you ever mention? What's the point? Ronald asked gently. I'm 65 years old with a security guard uniform and a pension that won't pay the bills. Who's going to listen to my ideas about design? Graham felt something crack open inside his chest. How many Ronald Hayes were there in the world? How many Lila Bennetts? People with vision and heart who had been dismissed by a system that valued credentials over character, profit over people. Ronald, Graham said slowly, what if I told you I was going to redesign the Riverside Heights interiors? And what if I asked for your input? The older man's eyes widened slightly. I'd ask what changed your mind. A preserved egg, Graham said. And for the first time in years, he felt like he was telling the complete truth. That evening, Graham found himself standing outside Bennett's family kitchen in a neighborhood he rarely visited, despite living only 20 minutes away. The restaurant was smaller than he had expected, tucked between a laundromat and a check-cashing place, but warm light spilled from its windows onto the darkening street. Through the glass, he could see Lila clearing tables, moving with the efficient grace of someone who had been doing this work for years. An elderly Korean woman. Her grandmother, he assumed, worked behind the counter, and despite the restaurant's obvious financial struggles, both women were smiling as they served the handful of evening customers. Graham hesitated on the sidewalk, suddenly aware of how out of place he looked in his expensive overcoat and Italian leather shoes. This wasn't his world. He belonged in boardrooms and wine bars, not family restaurants where the furniture didn't match and the art on the walls consisted of faded photographs rather than carefully curated pieces. But something about the scene through the window held him captive. He watched Lila laugh at something an elderly customer said, watched her grandmother taste the soup and add another pinch of seasoning, watched the easy intimacy between the generations that spoke of shared struggle and unconditional love. Graham had spent 3 days telling himself he was just being curious, but standing outside Bennett's kitchen, he realized he was hoping for something he couldn't name. Maybe redemption. Maybe just the chance to hear someone talk about spaces as if they mattered to the people who lived in them. Maybe the possibility of remembering who he had been before success had taught him to measure everything in profit margins. He pushed open the door, and a small bell chimed his arrival. Lila looked up from the table. She was wiping and froze. Mr. Sinclair, Graham, he corrected, and I was hoping I could buy dinner and maybe continue our conversation from the other day. Rosa Bennett emerged from behind the counter, studying this well-dressed stranger with the sharp eyes of someone who had spent decades reading people. At 78, Rosa had survived the Korean War, immigrated to America with nothing but hope and recipes, and build a life from determination and the kind of love that could transform simple ingredients into something that tasted like home. You're the architect, she said. It wasn't a question. Yes, ma'am. The one who made my granddaughter cry on Tuesday night. Graham felt heat rise in his neck. I hope I didn't. Not you directly, Rosa clarified, wiping her hands on her apron that bore the stains of decades of cooking with love. But that world you live in. All those people who think a piece of paper matters more than what's in here. She tapped her chest with a weathered finger. You hungry? Yes, ma'am. Good. People think better when their stomachs are satisfied. Lila, get this man some food and tell him what you told me about those apartments he's building. Lila shot her grandmother a mortified look. Almiany, he doesn't want to hear. Yes, I do, Graham said quickly. That's why I'm here. As Lila served him Rose's famous Korean fusion comfort food, a blend of traditional techniques and American ingredients that somehow created something entirely new and completely satisfying. Graham found himself in a conversation unlike any he'd had in years. You know what my grandmother taught me? Lila said, settling across from him with her own plate. She said that cooking and designing are the same thing. You're taking basic ingredients, or in design, basic rooms, and asking yourself, how can I make this nourish someone? How can I make this feel like love? Graham paused with his chopsticks halfway to his mouth, struck by the simplicity and profundity of the observation. I never thought of architecture that way. Most people don't, Rosa said, joining them at the table without invitation, but somehow making the gesture feel natural rather than intrusive. They think buildings are about showing off. How big, how expensive, how impressive. But real architecture, like real cooking, is about taking care of people. Graham looked around the small restaurant, noting how Rosa had created warmth and beauty from the simplest elements. The mismatched chairs somehow harmonized. The lighting made everyone's face look kind, and small details invited people to linger and connect. Nothing here was expensive, but everything felt intentional, chosen with love. When I first came to America, Rosa continued, I worked in other people's kitchens for 15 years. Rich kitchens, fancy kitchens, kitchens with equipment that cost more than most people make in a year. But you know what I learned? Graham shook his head, genuinely curious. The kitchens that made the best food weren't the ones with the best equipment. They were the ones where the cook remembered that food is love made visible. Same with buildings, I think. The best ones aren't the most expensive. They're the ones where the designer remembered that buildings are love made livable. The thing about affordable housing, Lila said, her voice growing stronger as she talked about something she clearly cared deeply about, is that people assume families with less money don't deserve beautiful spaces. But those families need beauty more than anyone. When you're struggling to make ends meet, when you're working multiple jobs and exhausted, your home has to be the place that restores you. Graham thought about his own expensive condo, all steel and glass and impressive views, and realized it had never once made him feel restored. It was beautiful in the way magazine spreads were beautiful, perfect but somehow lifeless. But beautiful costs more, Graham said, playing devil's advocate not because he disagreed, but because he needed to understand her thinking. Does it? Lila challenged, and he could see the passion that had drawn him to her observations in the first place. A coat of warm paint costs the same as cold paint. Positioning a window to catch morning light doesn't cost extra. Creating a layout that helps families connect instead of just exist together. That's about choice, not budget. She leaned forward, her eyes bright with conviction. My grandmother's restaurant doesn't have expensive furniture or fancy decorations. But every person who eats here feels welcomed, feels cared for. That's not about money. That's about intention. Rosa smiled and patted Graham's hand with fingers that bore decades of cooking burns and marriage ring worn thin by washing dishes. I knew you were hungry for more than food. Graham looked at this remarkable woman who had created abundance from scarcity, at her granddaughter who saw families instead of just units, at the small restaurant that felt more like home than his expensive office ever had. I want to ask you both something, he said slowly. What if we could change the way affordable housing is designed? What if we could create homes that nourish families instead of just sheltering them? Rosa and Lila exchanged a look that spoke of shared dreams and the kind of understanding that only comes from years of loving struggle together. Then Rosa said quietly, we better get started. The next 2 weeks transformed Graham's understanding of his own profession. Working with Lila on the Riverside Heights interiors reminded him why he had become an architect in the first place. Not to create impressive buildings, but to create spaces where human life could flourish. Every evening found the three of them gathered around one of Bennett's kitchen's small tables, which had been transformed into an impromptu design studio. Rosa would serve them dinner, while Graham and Lila spread architectural plans across the checkered tablecloth, and Ronald would arrive after his security shift, carrying decades of wisdom about what made buildings truly work for the people who inhabited them. "You know what I learned in 40 years of practice?" Ronald said one evening, studying Lila's latest sketches for the children's bedrooms. "The best buildings are the ones that make people feel braver. Not intimidated, not impressed, braver. Like they can handle whatever life throws at them because they have a safe place to come home to." Lila looked up from her drawings, pencil smudges on her cheek. "That's exactly what I was trying to create. These reading nooks aren't just about having a place to read. They're about giving kids a space that's completely theirs, where they can dream and plan and feel powerful." Graham watched this collaboration with something approaching wonder. In his professional world, design happened in sterile conference rooms with PowerPoint presentations and budget constraints dominating every decision. Here, in this tiny restaurant kitchen that doubled as their design studio, creation happened organically, with love and intuition guiding every choice. "The bathroom mirrors," Rosa said, appearing with fresh tea and the kind of practical wisdom that came from understanding human nature. "They're too high for children. When kids can't see themselves in their own home, they start to feel like they don't belong there." She was right, of course. Graham had never considered the emotional impact of mirror placement. But as Rosa spoke, he could picture a 7-year-old trying to brush their teeth while standing on tiptoes, feeling small and overlooked in their own space. "We can install adjustable mirrors," Lila said immediately, sketching the solution. "Or 2 mirrors at different heights. It costs almost nothing, but it sends a message that this home was designed for the whole family." Lila proved to be everything Harper was not. Intuitive where Harper was rigid, focused on emotional impact where Harper prioritized systems. Most importantly, Lila remembered that behind every design decision was a family who deserved to feel at home. But it was the small details that revealed the depth of Lila's understanding. She insisted on outlet placement that would allow for night lights without extension cords creating tripping hazards. She designed storage solutions that encouraged children to put away their belongings by making the process feel like play rather than chore. She created sight lines between kitchens and living areas that would allow parents to supervise homework while cooking dinner, fostering connection rather than isolation. "Every choice we make," Lila explained to Graham as they worked on the color palette for the common areas, "either says you matter or you don't matter to the people who will live here. The question is, what do we want these families to feel when they come home?" Harper's resistance was immediate and pointed. "Graham, you're setting a dangerous precedent. If word gets out that we're hiring consultants without proper credentials, then word gets out that we care more about the people who will live in our buildings than about professional gatekeeping," Graham replied, surprised by the conviction in his own voice. But he knew Harper's concerns weren't entirely unfounded. The architecture world was built on reputation and relationships, and taking risks with unconventional choices could have real consequences. He had spent years building his firm's reputation for reliability and professional excellence. It was Ronald Hayes who provided the solution, arriving at the restaurant one evening with a folder of documents that would change everything. "You know," the older man said, settling into his usual chair with the careful movements of someone whose body carried decades of honest work, "I still have my professional credentials. My license is active, and Hayes & Associates is still a registered firm." Graham looked up from his drafting table. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that maybe it's time for Hayes & Associates to come out of retirement," Ronald said with a slight smile that carried both humility and quiet pride. "As a consulting firm specializing in emotionally intelligent design, with Miss Bennett as our lead residential specialist." "You would do that?" Lila asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ronald's eyes crinkled with warmth as he looked at this young woman who had reminded him that age and wisdom could still serve a purpose. "Child, I've been watching buildings live and die for 40 years. I know good design when I see it, and I know good people when I meet them. That gift you have, the way you see what spaces need to be whole, that's not something they teach in schools. That's something you're born with, something you develop through caring deeply about people's lives. He gestured toward her sketches scattered across the table. What you've created here isn't just good design. It's revolutionary design. You're not just thinking about how to house people efficiently. You're thinking about how to help families thrive. Graham felt something shift inside his chest as he watched the exchange between Ronald and Lila. Here was a man who had every reason to be bitter about the way the industry had discarded him, choosing instead to use his remaining influence to lift up someone who represented the future of compassionate design. There's one condition, Ronald continued, his voice taking on the authority of someone who had spent decades leading architectural teams. We do this right. We document everything. We create case studies. We prove that emotional intelligence in design isn't just nice to have. It's essential for creating communities where people can build meaningful lives. Rosa Bennett, who had been listening from behind the counter while she cleaned the dinner dishes, came over and placed her weathered hands on the table where the architectural plans were spread. You know what you're really building? She asked, looking at all three of them. You're building hope. One room at a time, one family at a time. You're proving that everyone deserves to live in a space that sees their worth. The official announcement that Sinclair Architecture was partnering with Hayes and Associates on a Riverside Heights project sent quiet ripples through Chicago's architectural community. Most assumed it was a savvy business move, Graham Sinclair positioning himself as innovative and socially conscious. Only a few people knew the truth, that sometimes the most important partnerships are built not on credentials, but on the shared recognition that beautiful spaces should belong to everyone, and that the best design ideas can come from the most unexpected places. The day of the Riverside Heights presentation arrived with the crisp clarity of December in Chicago. Graham stood in the conference room on the 28th floor, watching Lila arrange the presentation materials with careful precision. She had traded her delivery uniform for a simple black dress and blazer, but her hands still trembled slightly as she organized the floor plans and color samples. "Remember," Ronald said quietly, adjusting his tie with the dignity of someone returning to his professional element, "you're not asking for permission to have good ideas. You're sharing solutions that will make people's lives better." Harper entered the conference room with the developer and city planning officials, her expression professionally neutral, but her eyes sharp with barely contained skepticism. Graham could read her thoughts as clearly as if she had spoken them. This was either going to be a triumph of innovative thinking or a career-damaging mistake. "Gentlemen, ladies," Graham began as everyone took their seats, "I'd like you to meet Lila Bennett and Ronald Hayes from Hayes and Associates, our consulting partners on the Riverside Heights interior design." The developer, Marcus Patterson, glanced between Lila and Ronald with the polite confusion of someone trying to place faces that didn't match his expectations. "I'm sorry, I don't believe I'm familiar with Hayes and Associates." "Boutique firm," Graham said smoothly, "specializing in residential spaces that prioritize family connection and community building." Lila stepped forward, her voice initially quiet but growing stronger as she began to speak about the designs that had consumed her thoughts for weeks. "The challenge with affordable housing is that families are often dealing with financial stress, work pressures, and limited space. Our design approach focuses on creating homes that restore and nurture rather than just shelter." She moved to the first display board, showing the modified floor plans. "By rotating the kitchen 15 degrees toward the main living area, we create sight lines that allow parents to supervise homework while cooking dinner. It's a small change that costs nothing but transforms how families interact." Ronald stepped forward, adding his decades of professional experience to Lila's emotional intelligence. "We've incorporated built-in storage solutions that also create cozy spaces for children. Reading nooks, window seats, areas where kids can feel safe and contained while still being part of family life." As they continued the presentation, Graham watched the room's energy shift. The planning officials leaned forward, asking questions about implementation. The developer's skeptical expression softened as he realized that these modifications would actually enhance marketability while staying within budget. But it was Lila's final point that sealed the moment. "Every family deserves to feel proud of where they live," she said, her voice carrying the conviction of lived experience. "These aren't just affordable units. These are homes, and homes should reflect the dignity and dreams of the people who live in them." The silence that followed was full of recognition rather than doubt. "These are remarkable concepts," the lead planning official said finally. "When can we see the pilot unit?" The weeks following the presentation passed in a blur of excitement and nervous energy. Graham found himself spending more time at Bennett's kitchen than in his own office, working with Lila and Rosa to refine details for the pilot apartment. The small restaurant had become an unofficial design studio, with sketches and fabric samples covering every available surface. "You know," Rosa said one evening as she served Graham and Lila dinner, "I haven't seen my granddaughter this happy since before her father got sick." Graham looked at Lila, who was absorbed in adjusting the color palette for the children's bedrooms. Her face lit with the kind of focused joy that comes from work that feels like purpose rather than just necessity. "She's extraordinary," Graham said quietly. "I've worked with dozens of professional designers, and none of them understand human nature the way she does." "That's because they learned design from books," Rosa replied. "Lila learned it from watching people. She knows what it feels like to need a space that loves you back." The validation came in unexpected ways. The pilot apartment, when completed, felt like something entirely new and affordable housing. Beautiful without being precious, practical without being cold. Local media covered the innovative design approach, and housing advocates praised the focus on family well-being. But the moment that mattered most to Lila came when the first family moved into their Riverside Heights apartment. Maria Santos, a single mother with 2 young children, walked through the space with tears in her eyes. "It feels like home," she said, running her hand along the built-in window seat where her daughter was already curled up with a book. "I've never lived anywhere that felt like home before." Lila stood in the doorway watching Mrs. Santos's children explore their new bedrooms, seeing their delight in the reading nooks and the way the morning light made everything feel hopeful. This was what she had dreamed of during those long years of delivering lunches and shelving her ambitions, creating spaces where families could thrive. "How does it feel?" Graham asked, joining her in the doorway. "Like remembering who I was supposed to be," Lila said softly. That evening, back at Bennett's kitchen, the 3 of them, Graham, Lila, and Rosa, sat around one of the small tables, sharing a meal and a sense of accomplishment that felt larger than any individual success. "You know what I realized today?" Graham said, setting down his chopsticks. "I haven't thought about profit margins or efficiency ratings in weeks. I've just been thinking about whether our work makes people happy." "That's because you remembered something important," Rosa said, refilling his tea. "Buildings are like food. They can nourish or they can just fill space. But it takes heart to know the difference." Graham looked around the small restaurant, noting how Rosa had created warmth and beauty from the simplest elements. Mismatched chairs that somehow harmonized, lighting that made everyone's face look kind, small details that invited people to linger and connect. "I want to ask you both something," he said. "What if Hayes and Associates became more than just a consulting partnership? What if we created a firm that specialized in design for real families? Affordable housing, community centers, schools, places where emotional connection matters as much as structural integrity." Lila's eyes widened. "You mean, stop delivering other people's lunches and start designing spaces that nourish people's lives," Graham said. "If you want to." Rosa Bennett smiled and reached across the table to squeeze her granddaughter's hand. "I told you that you see with your heart, Mija. Now someone else sees it too." 6 months later, Graham stood in his redesigned office, which no longer looked like something from an architecture magazine, but felt like a place where real conversations could happen. The gray walls had been warmed with subtle color, the furniture rearranged to create spaces for genuine connection. And yes, There were even a few personal photographs and a small easel where he had begun sketching again during lunch breaks. Lila knocked and entered, carrying not a delivery bag, but a portfolio case and the confident posture of someone who had found her place in the world. At 25, she had become the lead residential designer for Hayes & Associates, which had grown from Ronald's retirement project into a respected firm specializing in what the architecture magazines were now calling emotionally intelligent design. The Morrison Community Center project was approved, she announced, setting down architectural plans that showed a senior center designed to feel like an extension of people's homes rather than an institutional facility. They loved your suggestion about the art studios. Graham smiled, remembering his own abandoned painting and how Lila's vision had reminded him that creativity could be reclaimed at any age. Ronald's going to be pleased. This was his favorite project. He's already planning workshops for the seniors, Lila said, teaching them about architecture and design history. He says it's time for their stories to influence new buildings instead of just living in old ones. They work together in comfortable silence, reviewing plans for their latest project, a mixed-income housing development that would seamlessly integrate affordable units with market-rate homes, creating community instead of segregation. Harper knocked and entered, her expression warmer than it had been in years. The transformation hadn't been immediate, but gradually she had come to respect Lila's insights and to see that innovation sometimes required stepping outside traditional boundaries. The Chicago Housing Authority wants to discuss expanding our emotionally intelligent design principles citywide, Harper announced. They're particularly interested in how our family-centered layouts have reduced tenant turnover and increased community satisfaction. Schedule it, Graham said, and make sure to include Rosa Bennett in the meeting. Her insights about creating gathering spaces have been invaluable. After Harper left, Lila turned to Graham with a question that had been on her mind for weeks. Do you ever regret it? Taking the risk on someone without credentials. Graham considered the question seriously. You know what I regret? All the years I spent designing buildings that looked impressive but didn't understand people. All the families who had to live in spaces that met every technical requirement but somehow missed the point entirely. He gestured toward the window, where construction cranes marked the locations of 3 different Hayes & Associates projects. What we're doing now, this is what I was supposed to be doing all along. I just needed someone to remind me that architecture is about more than structures. It's about creating spaces where human life can flourish. That evening, Bennett's Kitchen hosted a celebration dinner for the team that had transformed affordable housing design in Chicago. The small restaurant was packed with an unlikely group: architects and city planners, community advocates, and resident families, all gathered around tables that Rosa had somehow arranged to feel both intimate and inclusive. Lila looked around the room, seeing Graham deep in conversation with Mrs. Santos about her daughter's success in school since moving to Riverside Heights, seeing Ronald teaching a group of young architects about the importance of designing for multiple generations, seeing Harper laughing with Rosa over stories of their respective grandmother's wisdom. "Look what you created, Mija," Rosa whispered, joining Lila by the window that looked out onto the Chicago street where everything had started with a wrong delivery to the right floor. "We created it," Lila corrected. "All of us together." As the evening wound down, Graham found himself standing outside Bennett's Kitchen with Lila, both of them looking up at the Sinclair building where this journey had begun. "I have something for you," Graham said, pulling a small wrapped package from his jacket pocket. Inside was a preserved egg, golden and perfectly centered in a small display case, with a plaque that read, "For seeing what matters most, Elby from GS." Lila laughed, tears in her eyes. "You remembered. It's hard to forget the moment someone reminds you what you're really supposed to be doing with your life," Graham said, as they stood together on the sidewalk, 2 people whose lives had been changed by the simple act of paying attention to what hearts need rather than what systems demand. The lights of Chicago stretched endlessly around them. Somewhere in the city, families were gathering in homes designed with love. Seniors were discovering that their wisdom still mattered, and young people were learning that credentials matter less than character. Sometimes the most profound transformations begin with the smallest acts of authentic human connection. A lunch delivered to the wrong floor. A conversation that sees beyond surfaces. A willingness to believe that everyone deserves spaces that understand their hearts. "Thank you," Lila said quietly, "for seeing me when I was invisible." "Thank you," Graham replied, "for reminding me how to see."